Hello, welcome to today's webinar on Sysrev, using Sysrev in the classroom. My name is Sarah Young. I am a social sciences librarian at Carnegie Mellon University and also director of our evidence synthesis program. I'm currently also working as a research and strategy consultant for Sysrev. And I'll have my colleague TJ introduce himself.
Thanks, Sarah. My name is TJ Pizzata. I'm the product lead of Sysrev. My main focus is how can we continue to develop and innovate with Sysrev so that it better suits the many ways that our users use it. But for here, I'm just happy to help out today. Thanks, Sarah.
Thanks, TJ. Okay, so I'm excited today to talk to you about how Sysrev, I think, is a really useful tool for teaching students disciplinary and research literacy skills through collaborative literature reviews. This is something that we've done quite a bit at Carnegie Mellon, and I'll talk to you a little bit about our experiences using Sysrev in this way. So we're going to talk a little bit starting about the challenges of getting students engaged with scholarly literature, how collaborative literature reviews using sort of a systematic or systematized approach can help students engage more deeply with research and help them build these skills in reading academic research and evaluating the quality of research. We'll also talk about and demonstrate some of the functionality that Sysrev brings to the table that can be used to support these types of class-based literature reviews. I'm also going to end the talk with a few examples from CMU and other universities where this has been effectively used in the classroom, and we'll have probably time for questions as well. That said, I do welcome any questions as we move through the webinar. Feel free to interrupt or throw something in the chat. TJ will be monitoring that, and we can certainly stop and answer questions anytime. Okay. So again, the challenge that we're sort of focusing on today is how we get students, particularly higher ed students, more engaged with complex academic texts. So this is something I've encountered quite a bit in my role as a librarian, working with both undergraduate and graduate students. And this is a skill that's really fundamental across almost every discipline. So no matter what field, students need to be able to read, understand, and evaluate academic research. This is what allows them to ultimately situate their own work within the larger scholarly conversation in a discipline. And it also equips them to navigate these complex information landscapes that we find ourselves in. And also become more informed, critically thinking members of society. So all of that said, it's important to also note that explicit instruction and reading comprehension of academic writing is probably quite rare in the curriculum, at least in my experience. It's one of those skills that I think is often just assumed that students are going to somehow pick up as they move through their academic careers. I really like this paper by Catherine Hubbard. She's a lecturer at University of Hull and a specialist in higher education pedagogy. And she wrote this great article on disciplinary literacies in STEM that really addresses this issue. And she notes that, getting students fully engaged with research, we need to really embed literature-based teaching in the curriculum, not just sending students away to read a paper, but really making it a meaningful part of class instruction. And she also notes that, in addition, this needs to be accompanied by in-person discussion of text. So this really gets at a more engaged approach of interacting with the academic literature, having students think about the challenges of reading and making sense of academic texts, and thinking through together in discussion how researchers disseminate findings and place their research within this broader conversation in a field. So this is where I think collaborative systematized literature reviews really come into play as a pedagogical tool for integrating academic reading comprehension in a meaningful way in the classroom. So when I say systematized literature reviews here, what I mean is a literature review that employs some kind of systematic approach. So we're not talking necessarily about full systematic literature reviews, There's a lot of opinions about whether students or undergrads or even graduate students should be doing systematic reviews. There's a lot of real implications for what a systematic review implies in terms of its comprehensiveness and rigor. On the other hand, there are elements of the systematic literature review process that can be adapted for classroom use. And this makes student literature reviews more structured and more step by step. So this really helps take what is often a very messy and unclear process and turns it into a clear pathway that I think better guides students through doing a literature review, kind of easing that cognitive load, providing opportunities for scaffolding learning outcomes, and ultimately resulting in a more useful learning experience. So systematized reviews can address a broad range of learning outcomes. Um, if you think about the sort of workflow for a systematic review, each of these steps can lend itself to some sort of learning opportunity for students. So for example, the process of identifying a research question for a systematic review can really help them understand skills and learn skills in scoping research questions. Searching for studies, which is my area of expertise. Um, there are things that we can take from systematic approaches to searching for research to give students better skills in literature searching for any kind of purpose. Um, Also, it's useful to sort of think about these projects as real research experiences. So, systematized literature reviews are in and of themselves a valid and useful contribution to research. And so, getting students involved in the research process, learning how to collaborate with their peers, collaborate with faculty, and even in some cases leading to publishable research products, this can be a really exciting opportunity for students. And we'll see a couple of examples of that at the end of the webinar. All right, so let's sort of shift gears here and think about why Sysrev is a useful tool in this context. When we think about systematic approaches to literature reviews, or really any literature review, we understand this to be a very information-intensive process. So they often involve gathering research studies across many databases, screening through those records, deciding what's relevant, what's irrelevant, based on some eligibility criteria. And all of this is meant to add a level of transparency and rigor to the literature review. Um, if this is done in a collaborative way, then you also need a way of identifying where reviewers have conflicting decisions on a paper and ways to resolve those disagreements. So we need some kind of software to support these kinds of projects. Um, there are other softwares out there, things like citation managers, Zotero, for example, that could be used, but those aren't really specifically designed for collaborative literature reviews. There are other platforms for collaborative systematic reviews, but those tend to have a very rigid process and may not have sufficient flexibility to adapt to the different kinds of review workflows that you might implement in the classroom. So Sysrev offers sort of the best of both worlds. It gives us a platform for collaborative literature review, but it's also highly flexible. So it's a great tool for adapting to these classroom-based projects. I'm just going to go over a few of these things quickly, and then we're actually going to dive into Sysrev and take a look at this in the platform. But Sysrev is great for managing teams. You can easily set up a large-scale collaborative review, adding as many collaborators as you need. There's an engaging sort of dashboard where you can track progress and also maybe get students a little engaged with some friendly competition and goal setting. And the interface really is quite easy to pick up, so it doesn't distract from the real learning at hand. There's also some neat functionality where you can provide in-platform instructions, class assignments, that sort of thing. We'll take a look at this. And there's also some different levels of permissions control. So this would allow you to have an instructor or TA with some level of permissions that where students have sort of a lesser level of permissions in terms of, for example, the ability to view other students' answers in a project. And then finally, with the premium and enterprise versions of Sysrev, you get access to these analytics tools. And these can be really helpful in helping you understand where students might be maybe misunderstanding a concept, where there might be a lack of clarity around eligibility criteria. And this can really lead to some really useful deeper dives in classroom discussions. So we'll take a look at all of these things in Sysrev itself. Let's pop over to this. And I'm going to actually put this link in chat. So this is a link to a public project that I made. It is kind of a nice little template for this kind of classroom project. And just to give you a sense of what this might look like in practice. So here we have sort of a fake review on mindfulness programs for student well-being in higher ed. So this might be the kind of review you could have students working on, say, in a psychology course, or even an educational science course. So here we are providing in this kind of wiki-like box all of the eligibility criteria for the review, just at the student's fingertips. When I click on that edit button, you can see this is a nice editable box using Markdown, which is a really simple markup language that helps you create really nice, nicely formatted text. We can easily add students to this project in a number of ways. You could provide this link. This is a share link where anyone who clicks on it would be prompted to be added to this project. So this you could provide, for example, in a course management system like Blackboard or Canvas, as a really easy way of getting students into this project. An alternative, I'm going to open this sort of fake class roster that I created. I'll bring this over. Oops. So here we have a class. This is our list of emails. I can easily copy this, paste it into this invitations box, and send those invites to students directly. So you can see it's very easy to get any number of students quickly into this project for a course. We can also share documents in this project documents feature. You can upload any kind of, for example, assignment description, any kind of document so that students have that quickly and easily for their work in the review. Okay, I'm gonna shift gears a little bit and go into our settings. So the settings allow us to do a lot of different things that can add, flexibility to whatever kind of workflow that you have decided works for your course. First of all, permissions. I mentioned that there are different levels of permissions. So for example, let's say TJ, who's already in this project, is one of our TAs. I can up his permissions to admin, and this is going to give him the ability to do things like create labels, view student work and analytics, and other things that I might want a TA to do. This is me in a different account that I have. I have member status. This would probably make sense for a student. And we'll take a look and see how that sort of looks once we get to some of the other functionality. Some of the settings that we can think about for our review workflow, you can have a single setting. This is going to have set it up so that only one reviewer or one student is looking at each article. I think generally speaking for a class, you want at least two students looking at each article. Again, this can create some really interesting opportunities for discussing concepts when students maybe disagree on whether or not an article should be included, for example. So balanced and full will give you an opportunity to have students both reviewing the same article. Full is a great setting for when you're initially getting started with a review for piloting a set of criteria. So this is going to prioritize records that have already been looked at by another reviewer or another student. So that way you can have students work on, say, reviewing 50 records, and with the full setting, you'll know that you'll get at least two reviews on all of the records that were reviewed. Another option here that might be useful for a classroom setting is the entire team setting. So this is where everyone on the review project will be looking at every article. So this might be something you'd want to do given a specific review that you might be working on, where you want all the students looking at all of the articles. So this is nice functionality for, I think, a classroom setting. Generally speaking, for reviews, we stick to two reviewers. I'm going to save these settings for a moment. Another really important setting, I think, for student projects is label blinding. This, of course, is also useful for typical systematic review, where you don't want reviewers seeing the answers that other reviewers have already applied. So typically, we'd be turning this on. And again, for students with member-only status, they won't be able to see the answers from other students. So a lot of different ways we can set this up for a classroom context. Okay, I'm going to show you real quick how the review process works. I'm actually going to go into my other account, which is kind of the student view. So this is where I don't have any kind of advanced permissions. And for students, it's simply a matter of logging into the project and clicking review. So it's a pretty straightforward way to get them quickly into reading titles and abstracts. You can also attach full text PDFs to these records if you want students reading full articles. And then they're simply making a decision here, yes or no. Just going to sort of randomly do this. And maybe TJ, at this point, if you want to go in and make a few decisions of your own, we can see what conflicts look like. So I'm going to go ahead and just make some quick include, exclude decisions. TJ will do the same. And let's see, I'll come back to this project. So again, this is where I have administrative access. I'm going to refresh the page. Let's see how we're doing. Yeah, so we've got at least a few articles that both TJ and I have reviewed. And you can see we've got a conflict here. So this is a really quick, easy way of getting to records. That must have been after. Let's go back to the page just to see if these right numbers are adding up. Yeah, so we've got two conflicts. You can quickly get to those, click on the record, and then sort of see who made which decision. Again, we have found in practice that this is a really nice way of getting students to sort of critically think about the research, the criteria for review, and why they might have decided to include or exclude a study. This can lead to some really nuanced discussions about maybe how we operationalize certain terms or concepts in a particular discipline, for example. So this is, just wanted to show you the conflict resolution if you're not familiar with it. Again, a really useful tool for these sort of class-based projects. I'm going to show real quick setting up labels. If you're already familiar with this, this will be not new information, but just to give you a sense of how this would work for a class project. Labels are kind of the bread and butter of Sysrev. It allows us to categorize and extract information from records and articles. And it's really how we go from turning a bunch of unstructured literature into a structured data set. So we can create Boolean categorical string labels. Group is a special kind of tabular label we're not going to get to today, but potentially useful for more complex data extraction. So for example, for a category, a categorical label, we might want to add something like what type of study is this? Maybe we're sort of teaching students how to identify different study designs, for example, the difference between an experimental study and an observational study. So I'm going to actually call this study type. And we can give it categories here, such as maybe experimental, experimental, observational, and maybe editorial, like that, and maybe review, for example. So there's some other settings here I won't go into in a moment, but just to give you a sense of what this looks like in the review mode. Let's do one more label. We're going to do a string. Let's say this is impact, maybe outcomes. So here we might want students to just type out what outcomes or impacts of mindfulness were studied in this paper. And here we can just leave an open-ended question where students can type in their answers. Again, sort of going back to the student view, I'm going to refresh this. And now when I click on the review tab, I actually have some different options here where I can start filling out some of these, some of these answers, for example. So again, you can see how you can build a fairly complex project and really get students engaging with different aspects of research and learning some different things about how to interpret what a research study says and tells us. Okay, so I'm going to shift gears again. I'm going to head over to a different project. So this is just a more developed project with a lot more articles and some work that's already been done. Just popping over to this so we can take a look at analytics. This is the feature of Sysrev that allows us to really sort of start digging down and seeing where students might be consistently disagreeing on a concept. I could highlight areas of misunderstanding and again, raise some really nice points of discussion for the classroom. So for example, this is going to give us concordance and discordance on all of our Boolean yes/no labels. So for example, we have an include label, is this study relevant or not? And it will tell us for each user how much they agreed with the other reviewer. So let's, if we have percent here, this user we can see agreed 92% of the time with the other reviewer for the article. And 8% of the time there was a disagreement. What we'd recommend in these classroom projects is having, for example, a trained TA or the instructor actually doing some screening. So maybe creating kind of a benchmark set of screened records where you can come into this analytics mode and then quickly compare, for example, a given student to the answers that a TA or instructor gave. So this could give you a quick view of where that student might be maybe misunderstanding a concept or just understanding it in a different way than was intended. There's also a labels tab that gives us sort of a detailed view of all of the labels in a project. So this is where, again, if you've created a lot of complex labels to pull out a lot of different information, you can really get to, again, sort of discordance or where a student or maybe a set of students might be consistently disagreeing on something. This is, again, another point for potential classroom discussion to sort of clarify concepts. And again, just a nice way to sort of analyze the progress and general understanding in this project. Okay. I wanted to point out one other thing that we're not going to spend a lot of time on today, but if you're not familiar with it, this is A somewhat new feature of Sysrev, and that is the auto labeler. The auto labeler is a large language model integration, so you can actually run OpenAI's GPT-4 or Gemini with your labels. So basically semi-automating or fully automating the extraction of information from your titles, abstracts, and full text. And there's a lot of actually really interesting uses for this for a classroom project. So for example, one possible use is to run that auto labeler across your entire project for a given label. So the auto labeler actually performs quite well for a lot of different types of questions. For example, maybe going back to our mindfulness project, we could create an auto label that categorizes all of the records in this project based on the outcome that was measured. You know, was it stress? Was it learning? Was it well-being, etc. This would create a way of both comparing answers to student answers, but also creating groups of articles that you could then assign to different groups of students. So just to show you how that would work, I'm not going to run the auto labeler, but if we had run it, we could use this filter to create a filter on, for example, um, outcomes and some value of that auto label. So we might say, give me all of the records that the auto labeler tagged as about stress. That will then give us a link that we can take and assign to students. So the links here in Sysrev are all meaningful links. You can share these links and students will then immediately be taken to that filtered set of articles. Just to show you how this would work in another context. Another way you might do this is, let's go ahead and look for the term stress. So here we found 65 articles that mention the term stress. So we might want to assign this group of articles to a certain set of students. I can just copy this link, give it to students in, say, our course management system, throw it into, they would, then link to that page, and you can see that they're immediately taken to that same filtered set of records. This now becomes a filtered review. When they click on this tab, they're only reviewing those records. So just a nice way of grouping studies. So you may have a certain set of students looking at different types of articles. Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and jump back to our slides. I think that gives us a good overview of a lot of the functionality in Sysrev that can lend itself well to these kinds of projects. I just want to talk a little bit now about some examples where we've used this in practice. So the first is from my own context at Carnegie Mellon University. We've actually used Sysrev for a number of courses for student-led systematized and scoping reviews. This one in particular was one of the first applications of this where we had a small summer research experience course using Sysrev to manage a scoping review on reflection and reflective exercise in student learning. This was a really great experience for these students, I think, in part because the research itself was interesting to them. This is something that, they're often faced with in classes, given these sort of reflective exercises, journaling, that sort of thing. And I think they could really relate to understanding, what that means for practice and their own learning. So they got really engaged in this review, and I think it was a really excellent experience for them in terms of collaboration and contributing something that was ultimately useful to our collaborators at the university. So this was led by our collaborators in the Office of Undergraduate Research, along with some colleagues in the library. And the scoping review itself provides a basis for evidence-based guidance and best practices development that is now being used by faculty at the university. So again, here you have an example where students are really contributing to something that has real world implications. This has been presented, I think, at a couple of different conferences, and there's a link here to a presentation if you're interested in learning more. We'll share these slides and the recording after the webinar. Another really great example of using Sysrev was this example at University of Liverpool. In this case, Dr. Nasir Mirza, who led this project, recruited actually high school students as well as undergraduate students. You can see it was quite a large group to review literature on epilepsy genes and proteins. And this was not so much a systematic review as actually a creation of a literature-derived database. So here they were extracting data from journal articles that created this database that is now a really useful tool for researchers to identify novel pathways toward promising epilepsy treatment. So really interesting use case, again, giving students an opportunity to engage in research in a meaningful way. This actually has a public project. I'm going to go ahead and link out to that so you can see what that looks like. So this is the project itself. You can see all the students here. You can see very easily that I think they must have been assigned maybe 500 records each. So easy way of tracking student progress, and where students could easily see, how much work they had done towards some goal. And then again, the data here is exportable and has been used in epilepsy research since. So this article published in 2022 gives you a better sense of how this work has been impactful for epilepsy research. Okay, with that, I'm just going to sort of wrap up with a few recommendations. This, again, coming from our experiences in using Sysrev in this way. We certainly recommend, clear instructions, especially if you're having students screen records for eligibility for review. I think if you have had experiences with doing a systematic review yourself, you would know that the eligibility criteria can be a very challenging set of criteria to define in a way that all of the reviewers are on the same page. And that's even with, trained, domain experts, let alone students. So providing clear criteria, but also iterating on those criteria and using those, potentially, conflicts around inclusion as a way of continuing to hone, discuss, and refine the criteria for the review. Also, I mentioned recommending that instructors or TAs do some screening, sort of create a benchmark set of articles that you can easily use to compare to student screening. Again, this will be just a nice tool to identify areas where there might be misunderstanding. Using label blinding and even entire team review, which we talked about for the pilot screening. This gives you a chance to have everyone looking at the same set of articles that you can then come back into the classroom and discuss. Pilot screening a small number of records, and then again, sort of doing these small batches and facilitating these conflict resolution discussions in the class. Again, it sort of adds to that deeper engagement with the literature. Checking those analytics regularly for comprehension, and as I've mentioned, using these conflicts and decisions as opportunities for more discussion. And then there's a whole other world of learning opportunities, I think, with these kinds of review projects. We've had students learning, for example, advanced searching techniques in academic databases. I definitely highly recommend having a librarian involved in these kinds of courses. We've had some really interesting discussions with students about sort of the ethics of scholarly publishing and open access and equitable access to research. This comes up when we, go about finding the articles, the full text articles for our review, and, hit some paywalls where we don't have access to certain research. So this can be a really interesting point of discussion for these kinds of projects as well. Um, the epilepsy project, I think, is a great example of how you can actually build a data set from literature. This can lead to all kinds of opportunities for data science projects, learning how to go about cleaning and wrangling data, visualizing data, and doing data analysis. And then with the auto labeler, if you have the premium or enterprise account to Sysrev, you can actually use the auto labeler with students. This can give them an opportunity to learn some techniques around prompt engineering and prompt design, and sort of understanding the pros and cons of using AI in a research context. So that brings us to the end of the webinar. Um, we've got lots of resources here. There's our knowledge base, a YouTube channel, which is where this webinar recording will live. And you can also connect with us on LinkedIn. That's where you'll see updates about upcoming events, webinars, and that sort of thing. If you ever have questions about Sysrev, please reach out via support. And then these are just the references that I referred to in the presentation. I also want to highlight, speaking of upcoming events, a really exciting three-part series that we have coming up starting in sort of mid-October with Neil Hadaway. Neil is an expert in evidence synthesis methods, particularly in environmental and social policy. And he'll be talking about sort of best practices and practical solutions for conducting rigorous and transparent reviews over the course of three really exciting webinars. So this link here will get you to the more information about this as well as registration.